Anyway, unless there are any questions, let's roll. Did we do women's rights last time? I think we started. This is the thing that surprised me about my grandfather when I went into it. My grandfather in 1945 authored the first Equal Rights Amendment in the U.S. Senate that actually he was able to get to the floor. He had tried it a couple years ahead of time, got up to the floor. It got a majority vote, but not the two that were needed. And of course, you all know that this didn't actually pass until 1973. But he was way ahead of his times on this, always asked to speak, always had women's groups that asked to speak. When they were building Mount Rushmore in 1939, he petitioned to have Susan B. Anthony put on Mount Rushmore, which didn't go over, went over like a lead balloon at the time. Wondering where this all came from, because he once again grew up in an era where, you know, the man wore the pants in the family. But if you remember, my grandmother was anything but a typical woman.
So she had a lot of influence.
I am guessing that she was basically pumping him, you know, with ideas and whatnot.
I remember last week, I really wondered, you know, there was so much, you were talking so much about George's life, that I kept wondering, well, what was his wife doing then? You know,
she really stayed largely out of the picture, stayed involved with her own causes, really spent the time in the first, I guess his first term, spent a lot of time with my father, raising him and taking care of him. He was homeschooled. But obviously he was at home a lot, and this is where I just have to speculate.
Well, with all that traveling back and forth he did, it made me wonder, they must have been like two ships in the sea.
Right. And she was rarely at any political function that he was at. That was sort of unusual. Even if there was some kind of state dinner or something, he would go and she would stay home. She kept to herself a lot. She did suffer from some depression as a result of, you know, losing her father and her brother and her first child, and clearly had some issues. She was a remarkable mother, or to my father, and a remarkable grandmother, but very different. Visiting that house was unlike anything you've ever seen. Anyway, this is one area where he seemed to be rather progressive, but as we'll get into race later on, I'm not really sure who jumped. Oh, I've got it. That's right. I do it. He continued with the Merchant Marine, and not only was it important to get the ships built, but as the war ended, or it was becoming clear the war was going to end, we had to get rid of this excess shipping. And it's something you don't think of, but how do you get rid of the ships without just giving them away? And he was involved in a lot of that. He was very much pro-labor here, which of course was one of the things that helped get him elected, because obviously Merchant Marine was very much labor-based. He had the proxy for every Republican on his committee. Can you imagine that today? You know, a Republican saying to a Democrat committee chair, "Oh, you can vote for me if I'm not there." I mean, they'd be impeached by either party. It just was a very different time in that. And even though there was a lot of bickering and fighting, there was an incredible amount of partisanship. And obviously, that had to be during the war. So that was part of it.
Did MEBA appear at this point with all the Merchant Marine?
Did
MEBA? Wait a minute, what is it? It's an acronym.
Maritime.
It's that location as you're on your way to St. Michael's. They have.
Yeah, on the right as you're going to St. Michael's.
It's that facility there.
Did they train
Oh,
It didn't used to be entry level, and I think now it may be entry level.
maritime engineering, MBA.
Yes.
I have no idea whether that was created as a subset of all
Marine
this.
Engineers Beneficial Association.
Okay,
And it's essentially a union, but it's, the establishment there is for training.
Right.
And I didn't know what that had to do, whether that was, I don't know when that was established.
right. My grandfather was very supportive of the unions early on, but not so much later on, because he felt like things were sort of getting out of control, and we'll deal with that a little bit. The Bay became a big issue his second term. Even though the war was going on, he was still pushing for the Bay Bridge, and of course there was no support for that during the war.
Was that?
Very supportive of the seafood industry and voted for tariffs on, Japanese seafood. A lot of things there that pretty much went under the radar, but it was nice to see that he was at least thinking that way. But I think probably every Maryland senator we've ever had has been pro-Bay. Did I talk about the Christmas speech?
Yeah.
Yeah.
You did, yeah.
Yeah, the Christmas, this is where I know a little bit of repetition. I'm not going to go over again, but he really was putting Christmas into so much that he did. I mean, he would send every senator a Christmas gift every year, a small Christmas gift and a Christmas card. Christmas was an incredible deal to him. The Bretton Woods Agreement, and this was, so someone with a much better economic background than I. He was heavily involved in this agreement, which really kind of set up the global economy that have today. Dollar replaced gold as the standard, established the World Bank, and really, provided exchange rates so that there could be more global economy, and stimulated and equalized trade after the war. This was really a landmark thing that once again, during the war, and it's interesting, here it is 1944, the war is still going on, but even in 1944, it was pretty clear where things were headed, and people were thinking ahead. 1946 election, he lost. You can learn more about him as a person and as a senator when you look at why he lost the election. He did not lose in the general election. He would have won, if he'd been the Democratic nominee, he would have won a third term. The Democratic Party decided to get rid of him. The Democratic Party, the Governor O'Connor basically was in cahoots with the other senator, Miller Tidings. And they sort of conspired to get rid of him because they thought my grandfather was too conservative. He was sometimes voting with Republicans. He wouldn't always show up at the Democratic meetings because he would say he's too busy doing his job, didn't want to get involved in the politics side of things. And so Herbert O'Connor, the governor decided to run against him in the primary. And, you'll see what happened. The Democrats tried to put in price controls after World War II to basically get the economy going. My grandfather took a very Republican position, and he opposed that, feeling that we ought to let the market do what the market was going to do. And of course, the Democrats were absolutely furious with him. That literally, his vote on that happened a week and a half before the primary. And that probably sealed his fate. He'd lost a lot of labor support. He opposed the maritime strike.
Too old at 68.
And definitely age was a factor. O'Connor was a very vibrant, much more liberal, much more New Deal-ish kind of person. My grandfather just felt like there needed to be a blend of progressive ideas, but conservative approach to how money is spent and whatnot. that just did not set well with the Democrats at all. So he also did a terrible job of campaigning. He was so busy with committee work that he wasn't out politicking, and he actually had my father go out and do most of the campaigning because he just couldn't do it. And like we said, he lost to this Governor O'Connor, who then went on and won. He lost Baltimore City and Western Maryland, but basically carried the rest of the state. But once again, he was running against a very popular governor, and O'Connor barely won the primary, but barely won the general election. My grandfather wasn't even remotely upset because his attitude was, okay, now I go on to all the stuff that I really need time to do. And that's what he did. Very unusual senator. He was the only senator with a PhD. He was the only senator to commute. He thought that living in Washington corrupted people because you got wrapped up in the political life there and forgot about the fact that you're representing a state. He was working a full-time job as a senator. He would send every senator a Christmas card and a small gift. He was very well liked, but he was very much out of the news, as I think I said before. So basically that gave him, plenty of time to move on and do some other things. He spoke very little, and like I said before, his speeches really read like college lectures. This business of claiming to have answered every letter that he ever received, and I honestly think he did it. Very, very deliberate and studious, would never, in today's world, he would drive people crazy because they would ask, normally when somebody's asked a question now, they sort of beat around the bush because they don't want to stick their neck out. My grandfather wouldn't beat around the bush. He would just say, I don't know, I haven't decided yet. And he would go research it, and he would wait until literally right before the vote, before he would cast his vote, which drove the Democrats crazy because they're trying to know whether they've got a majority for my bill, and here's my grandfather being terribly uncooperative. He just felt like, why stick your neck? Why cast a vote until you've literally got the maximum amount of information that you're allowed to get? He's completely nonpartisan. One of his close friends was Theodore McKeldin, who was twice mayor of Baltimore and governor for 2 terms. They would meet all the time, compare notes, and I have some of the letters between the two, and not only are they warm, but you can see that they're sharing ideas and actually listening to each other. And that's part of where my grandfather's nonpartisanship came from. One of the things that he said he did when he would go into the Senate lunchroom, he wouldn't go sit with his friends. He said, I've seen my friends other times. He would sit with the person who was the biggest thorn in his side, often a Republican that they didn't agree with, and he'd sit down and they wouldn't talk issues. He would connect with him personally, and after they would develop a personal rapport, then they would both kind of share their position. And my grandfather, there was no argument, there was no attempt to sell them on what he was doing. Like I said, he was not political. He was just a very congenial person, but he would have an understanding of where they were coming from. And he just felt it was important to really understand the other side of things. Oh my Lord, do we need that today? Because we've gotten so far from this attitude, which just drives me crazy. Would my grandfather be elected senator today? Absolutely not. That's my reaction. I think we've gotten too far to where, party is paramount, and Lord forbid you decide you're going to straddle the fence and look at both sides. Just very, very different, and amazing that he even was a U.S. senator. This is an editorial from the Baltimore Sun. There's a sort of inevitability about the junior senator from Maryland that his opponents find extremely wearing. Like Old Man River, he just keep rolling over the opposition, whether that opposition is a man or a set of apparently impossible conditions. It is a quality that has a high survival rate in politics, and it is more than once proved of high value in to the state as trying to read an angle to the state its possessor represents. He very successful in what he did, but once again, his unorthodox, slow, contemplative style. So let's move to number 3, and let's get to where it gets a little more controversial. And there are very few slides in number 3, so we're going to do a little bit of dialogue and really wonder, do I have to do that? Or?
I just find something for you.
Oh, yeah, I was going to talk about that, but we don't need to do that. Okay.
From Bruce? Oh, yeah, I thought so. I sent him that message. I said, you got 5 hours from Hans.
Okay, going to do a tiny bit of backtracking. Backtracking, and then I'm going to ask some questions. We talked about the Civil War, and of course, he grew up in the aftermath of slavery, and tragically, in his lifetime, he saw it get worse. There was a much better attitude towards race in the latter part of the 18th or 19th century, and you see that in everything. I mean, there were even around late 1800s, early 1900s, there were even blacks in Major League Baseball. And then we went back to nothing, to where, Jackie Robinson had to then be the first, when in fact he really wasn't the first. But Jim Crow kicked in, and of course, Jim Crow kicked in a lot of the critical part of his early, professional life. So that had to have been an interesting thing for him to have to deal with. This is from my own personal experience. I never heard my grandfather utter a racial slur, ever. I never heard him say anything even remotely derogatory. But then I think, as I said earlier, I never heard him really say anything negative about anybody. He never told a joke which belittled anyone. My grandfather didn't tell jokes. My father sort of inherited this. Both of them told humorous stories. They found the humor in everyday life, and that's what they did. But to tell a joke, I don't think I ever heard my father ever tell a joke. So consequently, when I got out in the teen world, I didn't have any jokes to tell anybody. I was completely unprepared to be a teenager, in the 50s and 60s, because teens don't want to hear stories; they want to hear the joke and the punchline. He showed an interest and cared for the black families living in Spocott. Spocott was an interesting place. It was an integrated property in that blacks and whites both lived there. Obviously, our family lived in the main house, and in the other houses, one of which you'll see at the Windmill Complex, which were inferior houses, but then they weren't atypical for the time, and I'll talk about that a little bit when we get up there. I always heard him tell stories about the people that would live with him at Spocott. I never knew whether they were a black family or a white family, because he talked about them exactly the same way. The story that so-and-so did, or when, Uncle Kent pulled the, you figure Uncle Kemp, well, it might be more likely a black name. Uncle Kemp pulls the mule out of the well and, all the stories. But he never referred to anyone as black or white. And of course, the term back then was colored, which it's a god awful word. Not that Negro or black doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah, I taught school and I had white kids that were or quote unquote white kids that had much darker skin than the kids we were calling black kids. I mean, I don't think we've ever come up with a good term. Afro-American was sort of nice because at least you were saying that they had African roots as opposed to Jamaican or something else. We never referred to blacks as inferior or less intelligent, and yet they certainly at Spocott lived in inferior conditions in the sense that they were living in a smaller house, and they were workers as opposed to the people that were writing the checks.
Did they have to rent those small houses?
No, there was no one paying rent. He paid workers, but whoever was living in Spocott basically, they basically had the rights to do pretty much what they wanted on the property. They didn't pay for their house, and they just and often there would be a dinner where everybody would get together and everybody sit down equally at the table, which always, so all of this sounds nice, but the question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to go through some data, would we call my grandfather a racist by today's standards? He certainly wasn't by standards back then, because you'll see some of his positions are a little bit unusual as we're going. Did you have something you wanted to ask?
Yes. Were there white families living and working?
There were white families too,
Yeah.
and of course before the Civil War, there were white families living and working on the property. There were slaves living and working on the property, but there were also free blacks living and working on the property. And what I would love to know more than anything, and not only why did my great-grandfather have slaves, other than they probably came with the property, is how did the free blacks and the slaves interact and get along? Because that had to be a little bit unusual, or were they even aware of who was who?
So there were slaves
There
on
were.
the property.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit.
During your grandfather's life?
Not during, no. During my great-grandfather's life, this is well before my grandfather. But once again, my grandfather's growing up under the shadow of my great-grandfather, so you have to feel that, the apple doesn't fall too far from the tree.
I suspect they were acutely aware of who was free and who was slave.
I would have to think that.
Because any baby born to a slave mother was slave.
Right.
It depended on the mother's status.
It was the mother's status,
And
correct.
there were, just if you look at Frederick Douglass's biography, his sister, enslaved, married a free man who eventually was able to buy her freedom, and any kids they had prior to that moment, any they had after them were free.
Right. I guess a better way to phrase my question is, obviously, if they were to stop and think about it, but in their day-to-day existence, they probably pretty much lived by the same rules. Whether if a slave had wanted to leave, could they have? My great-grandfather always told my grandfather that he freed his slaves before the Civil War. He did not file the papers of manumission to make it official. That leads me to believe that he still considered them slaves.
But even the free blacks were still kind of tied to there because there was a benefit. They had a
Right.
home, they had a job, they were getting paid.
And they could be captured and sold
And so.
in 12 years a slave. was-
Economically, they were still tied to that.
Right, so they were still very much tied to it and very much restricted in opportunity. So anyway, let's just sort of look at the evidence and then at the end kind of, see how it all plays out. Some of his views were very progressive. I mean, women's rights, very, very progressive there. Very much pro-Jewish, we'll talk about this a little bit, the Jews getting Homestead. But his father was an abolitionist slave owner, as we said, and so very much in 1964, one of the slaves on the property, and we talked about this, Columbus, joined the army, the Confederate Army, and fought in the war. My great-grandfather was very willing to admit that he was a slave, because anyone that released a slave to fight in the Civil War was paid some compensation by the state of Maryland. So the fact that, my father always said, oh, my great-grandfather didn't have slaves. Well, the fact that in 1864, he would ask for money for Columbus fighting tells me there was still, he may have been a very, very open-minded and loving guy, but he still was somewhat accepting of slavery. And I have to believe that. And of course, that, 1864 is 13 years before my grandfather's born.
Maybe he was just being a good businessman.
That could be true too. There are so many different ways to look at everything. Once again, if he's technically a slave, even though you don't really think of him as a slave, and the state's going to pay you $500 if you fight, why not get the $500? The family was never a wealthy family, so that's clearly a possibility. And my great-grandfather was also commissioner of the poor, which would seem to be sort of an unusual position for someone that was very much pro-slavery, very, very kind, caring person. But you could believe that everyone has value and is a good person and still accept slavery, because slavery was an economic thing, not so much a personal thing. And that may likely be where he was. And of course, he had two brothers that were very much Confederate sympathizers. And so clearly, my grandfather always said he was born a red-hot rebel. That tells me he was very aware of his Confederate roots, which may say a little bit about my great-grandfather also. But certainly it says a little bit about, the environment he grew up in. And of course, his relationship with Adeline had to have affected how he felt about a Black person, because he clearly adored this woman. And she really, she worked up to where she was she started as a cook and nurse, and she literally became the house manager. She basically ran the house and basically told everybody what to do, even though she couldn't read or write. She was that respected. She had to have had a huge impact on my grandfather's thinking. And then there, of course, is the middle name, named after this Loving Pierce, who, once again, was not an abolitionist because he couldn't be in Georgia, but clearly had some very I guess, a position of looking at all as thinking from a minister's point of view. We're all God's children. We all have value. We all should be treated with respect, which doesn't really mesh with slavery. But once again, if you don't have a choice about slavery, if you accept it as the economic way of life, the two can clearly mesh. I wonder about his relationship with Woodrow Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson, certainly he worked with for a couple of years, and Wilson was Wilson would definitely be a racist by today's standards. May have done some wonderful things. Interestingly, Wilson initially had Black support, but he failed to address, a lot of the Jim Crow issues that came up when he personally screened The Birth of a Nation, if you're familiar with that movie, which is was considered, you know, one of the top movies of the time, even though it's basically the history of the beginnings of the Ku Klux Klan. And he infuriated the nation with that. Once again, that's after my grandfather knew him, but clearly that thinking, and of course, you know, Wilson just didn't really do anything as a president to basically undo Jim Crow or work against segregation. But don't know whether he had any influence at all. But then you have to figure that my grandfather is, from that point on into his, you know, into the early 20s and 30s, is probably encountering a lot of rather racist views. We're not going anywhere. Is there a reason why the clicker, Justin, the clicker is not working?
Let me see. I wonder if the mouse got bumped off the screen.
While he's doing that, I'm wondering, what's the origin of the name Spocott?
Good question. That's an incredible story. My two great uncles, my grandfather's brothers, said it was an Indian word having something, you know, like Chesapeake, land of the waters. They thought it was some Native American term, but clearly it was not. My grandfather, in doing a lot of research, found that the person, and I may address this a little bit on the tour too, because I'm sure that the same question will probably come up. So I apologize. I'm sort of going to repeat myself. My grandfather did a lot of research and found that Stephen Gary, who was the one that was given the land grant for Spocott, fought in the Royalist Army to put Charles II back on the throne. One of the military leaders that grew up in the same area as Stephen Gary was a Sir John Spocott, which would be Spocott with an E. There's a possibility that we don't know the maiden name of Stephen Gary's wife, and we don't know the maiden name of Stephen Gary's mother. I have a sneaking suspicion that one of them is probably Spocott, and that's probably where it came from. I don't think he would just name the property after some military person that he worked with, although they may have been friends. It was very common in transcribing, we're talking about transcribing things, and transcribing documents back then, E's and O's were often missed because that big loop of an E often got made into an O. So my grandfather, it's a theory, but it seems to stand, there's a lot of evidence to back it up, that it should have been named Spocott. It may have initially been called Spocott, although the deed looks like Spocott. And my guess is it's a family name. Back in business here. Yes, his mother-in-law, fascinating woman. The story behind her is, I could talk a whole class on her. Her godfather was Civil War General G.P.T. Beauregard, the one that was at Fort Sumter, and he later fought in the Battle of Shiloh, major Confederate general. So she comes from very strong Confederate roots. She was largely raised by him. She was actually from Talbot County. The Braccos, she was a Bracco. The Braccos are from Talbot County. There's a very prominent Bracco back in your county's history. Apparently, John Bracco went and married a woman in Tennessee, and they were living in Tennessee at the time. Their whole family was apparently killed by the disease. All of her siblings and both parents were all killed literally at the same time by some disease. We don't know the disease. We don't exactly know the year. She was then raised by General Beauregard pretty much through her teen years. And she apparently was an incredible marksman. He promised her that if she could ride side saddle on a horse and with a pistol hit 3 out of 4 shots on a target, he'd give her the pistol and the horse. Well, she got 4 out of 4. So very, we can see some real strong Southern roots there. The Union Army burned her family's property. And they burned her family's property looking for General Beauregard, who was a very close friend with her parents, obviously, hence it wouldn't have been Godfather. The story that's told, I have no documentation of, and I'm dying to find out if it's true, but this was told to my grandfather by his mother, and he wrote down, bless his heart, he wrote the whole thing down the way she narrated. And basically, Beauregard was on the property. He and a major were hiding on the property. They burned all the buildings and the barns to try to flush him out. There were 13 haystacks. And they figured he must be in one of those. They lit all 13 haystacks on fire. One of them did not burn, so they stabbed it with bayonets. And that's where Beauregard and the major were hiding, and apparently had to go before they'd thoroughly done it. The major was seriously injured but lived, and Beauregard survived and went on. That's a pretty incredible story, but nowhere in Beauregard's history is that incident. So that could be completely made up. However, even if it's made up, you can very much see that this woman, my grandfather's mother-in-law, clearly would have been very much racist, and she was. According to my father, she was incredibly racist. Very upset that my grandfather allowed his son to play with black children on the Spocott property, although my father thought it was great. So clearly there's some racism that probably may have, certainly I have a feeling my grandmother may have had that racist bone in her body, although I never saw that either. But I have a feeling it may have been there lurking below the surface. Once again, we talk about this, the fact that he supported Hugo Black, the fact that he could overlook the fact that Black had been a member of the Ku Klux Klan at that time. By today's standards, I think we said this before, Black never would have been nominated. But people that were willing to overlook your past. And I have a feeling my grandfather would probably felt the same way. Just certain things were allowed to happen because they were just overlooked. And just, well, that's the way it is, or it's in the past. My grandfather, on several occasions, voted against the anti-lynching bill, which sounds horrible, except for the fact that you realize that didn't get signed into law until last year. Are you I mean, that just, when I heard that in the news, I fell out of a chair. You know, Biden just signed the anti-lynching bill. What? And the mindset before it was kind of my grandfather's mindset was it was a state issue, and the currently law is already prohibited, so why bother to have another law?
That's a very Republican view of things.
Right, exactly.
Well, and now in the current day, as you say, it's last year's law. Well, we don't use ropes to lynch anymore, we use guns. We're still lynching them. We just have different methods.
And you know, it was the symbolism, and the fact that my grandfather, I mean, a couple times he voted for it, but there were a couple times he voted against it. And I don't see any logic. Obviously, he was sort of ambivalent and felt it really, and he did say this, that it was a state law and the current laws already covered it, so it wasn't necessary.
Was it some other provision in those bills that made him vote for it?
I don't know, and that would be something I would have to go back and research and check. And you know, as you're pointing out, I don't know all the answers, but clearly there was something there. But And I find that unbelievable that something like that just went on so long. He was very connected, my grandfather was very connected with the Southern Democrats. It was a very strong bloc, all basically Harry Byrd was the lord and ruler, all of that. He was a senator from Virginia. My grandfather was a close friend of Harry Byrd, so there had to be a lot of Harry Byrd talk in his ear. My grandfather, clearly was opposed to, some of Roosevelt's legislation. Byrd was, particularly when the Brown versus Board of Education ruling came out, Byrd was he basically led the fight against that, and then he led the war in Virginia against it once it was put into effect. And, they finally removed his statue from Richmond in 2021. My grandfather thought he was a wonderful guy, but my grandfather, as you'll see, had friendships with people that we would be appalled that anybody would be friends with today. So, we can get into the statue argument again. As a matter of fact, you'll see something else interesting here, and here it is right here. In 1948, a donor gave money to build a statue to Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson. I played around that statue as a kid because that's Wyman Park. That's right near where I grew up in Baltimore. I never paid any attention to it. A couple guys sitting on horses. I never thought about the ramifications of it. And, and of course in history class, we studied the Southern generals and the Union generals, and we studied the strategy. And it wasn't a question of taking sides. It was a question of, this is history and this is the way it went. And my grandfather was in charge of the ceremony to basically dedicate the statue. And if you read his speech, he praises the military skill of the two generals. I mean, to read his speech today would probably, there was no the South should have won. It was a respect for the men and what they did, and like it says here, the skill of them as generals. Once again, that statue was taken down in 2017. So here's 1948. My grandfather is out of the Senate, and very much he's still interested in Civil War history, and he still has no issues with the things that we have issues with today. And that goes even a little bit further. This is the one friendship that just appalls me. This James McElhenney Thompson, they were classmates at Hopkins, and they had a lifelong friendship. He ended up being a New Orleans newspaper editor and had some national exposure. Strong supporter of Harry Byrd running for president. He always was nominating Harry for president. He published some of the most racist articles I have ever read. And a couple of his letters to my grandfather, I find appalling. My grandfather
respond to them.
My grandfather would respond. He would never belittle what he said. He would provide a little bit of an alternative. There was never, you're wrong. He would just deal with some legal aspect of it. But once again, my grandfather just wasn't combative. That wasn't his style. His style was to always keep peace. But they remained close friends.
Did that make it seem like he was accepting of that?
It does, and that's kind of what I'm going to get. I mean, one of the problems that, and this is my own opinion, so this is where I want you all to jump in and argue. Even in my childhood, there was an acceptance of the way things were. I didn't run into too many people. I ran into almost no one except a relative who I won't mention, who I like personally, but one of the send packing. I mean, he went so far as he was one of the Holocaust deniers. I mean, he was just way out there.
It's out there.
But, you know, there was, okay, slavery was a bad thing, but, you know, that's in the past, and just sort of, the world's getting better, so let's just sort of let it get better, and it'll sort of happen on its own. And I think my grandfather had a little bit of that. But then there were so many people that, you know, in the 30s and 40s that were rather racist that it would be hard to have a friend that, it'd be hard to have friends and not have at least a couple that were racist. What kind of an influence he had, I don't know. But the fact that with my beliefs, you know, you would have loved to pick up a letter where my grandfather says, "You're completely wrong, blah, blah, blah." Never happened. But once again, that also wasn't my grandfather's style. But, you know, I have to accept the fact that my grandfather may have had slightly racist views and just put them aside and just did what he had to do. We come back to this a little bit. I think I mentioned this before, or maybe I didn't. The Brown versus Board of Education Act, I did see a response to this. James Thompson wrote my grandfather this horrific letter about, you know, literally send the blacks back to Africa. This is awful. And they, you know, we shouldn't be paying a cent for, I mean, it was awful. And my grandfather just simply wrote, "I agree that I don't like this ruling," but came up with his own reasons. There was never an acceptance of what Thompson said. It was just, once again, my grandfather had gotten to be somewhat Republican view that he opposed excessive government intervention. You know, I mean, we see the same thing today, and I don't mean to sound like I'm anti-Republican.
Small government.
Hmm?
The Republican view is small government.
Right.
Yeah, smaller government, and yet at the same time, you know, they sort of flip-flop it. It's kind of whatever suits them. But my grandfather also, in his letters, he did talk about the plight of Afro-Americans, and felt that he mentions, I know he had several black friends. There were a couple of black business owners in Baltimore at the time that he was quite familiar with, and they wrote back. I've got some letters where they wrote back and forth. He felt his black friends felt that forced change might have a reaction. In other words, my grandfather actually said that they were opposed to Brown versus Board of Education because they thought that, you know, blacks have been making progress, and now to force something was going to cause a reaction, which it did. I mean, obviously, it was a very pro bit of Supreme Court legislation, but to say that it didn't cause a backlash, you know, would be incorrect. And I remember living through some of that backlash because I became kind of aware of things in the 50s that was in Baltimore, and I even saw some of that in my own family. You know, so once again, my grandfather's positions, and when you read the letter that he wrote to Thompson, there's nothing there that's anti-black. It's that it's more from the point of view of a politician, of a U.S. senator, you know, these ideas right here. Very much wanting to see progress, but not the government forcing it. So, you know, by today's standards, we would be appalled with that, because quite likely, if that had not happened, yes, there wouldn't have been a backlash, but we would have been a long time before we finally got around to changing things. And I think that's where you can clearly say my grandfather was wrong. And a lot of people back then were wrong. It wasn't going to happen on its own. Sadly, there just were too many people that were, you know, content with the way it was. Okay, this is actually from that letter to Thompson. I hope I can read from here. What a pity the Supreme Court did not let the schools Yeah, can one of you read it better than me? I'm at an angle.
History certainly teaches that efforts by mass movements backed by forced change, materially, economic, and social conditions, especially as between races strongly divergent, causes friction, unrest, and often defeats the main objective of closer cooperation which the advocates are seeking.
Right.
Well, that's a long sentence.
Yeah, so I mean, so what he's saying is that he doesn't support it, and yet it's certainly not an anti-black or a pro-segregation point of view. And of course, we see the same thing today. We try to take everything and you're either here or here, when the reality is the truth is somewhere in the middle. And of course, you can't survive politically if you're in the middle these days. I mean, our Maryland governor was a good example of somebody in the middle, and he would have no chance of getting the Republican nomination. And of course, he went out of his way to get the state road marker put up for Harriet Tubman. That would make him sound like this wonderful pro-black person. However, I have a letter saying that he's glad that they did that, but there were two Maryland Civil War generals that were more deserving. More Confederate Civil War generals that were more deserving. So my grandfather was still very much pro-history. History to him was more important than the modern, what side you take. And so it sounds wonderful what he did, and it was, and clearly he thought that was important, but he also tempered it with, maybe, history, maybe she isn't the most important part of history back then. And actually, the more we've uncovered, he certainly was wrong there, because she was involved in a lot of things. Okay, interesting questions. My ancestor owned slaves. Should I apologize?
I'm in the same boat. All I can say is I don't agree with them, and
That's the way it was.
I can't change what happened then.
Yeah, I'd just love to hear what you say. And because I get asked this question when I give tours of the windmill complex, and I'm very comfortable saying that my great-grandfather owned slaves. I think we need to talk about it.
So did a whole lot of people's great-grandfather.
That's right. And I get, and I've,
Politically today,
and I've led a number of tours where I've had an all-black audience, and the vast majority of them are just very comfortable with what I say. But every once in a while, I'll get somebody that says, well, aren't you ashamed of your great-grandfather? Or, and it would just kind of like, should I apologize? And it's an interesting question.
I wish history were different, but you can't go back and rewrite it.
No. I mean, sadly, it was the economic system that was set up at the time. It's nice to blame the system and not the people, but that is part of it.
This is just an unsolicited suggestion. But if I were asked that question, I think I would say, I'm uncomfortable knowing that history.
Right.
Because that, is that how you feel?
Well, yes, in many ways. I mean, I just have to face it, it's a fact. In many cases, I have names of the slaves. There's no doubt about who owned whom. I don't have total counts for who owned how many as of a given year or anything. I have one letter. One gal had married. She was a groom from right here in Easton, niece of William Hinson Groom, who was president of the Easton Bank, which is still sitting on the corner of Washington and Goldsboro. And she married somebody from Kent County and moved up there. And she did not marry well, let's say. Apparently he was a drunk. And she's always writing back to dear uncle, and I really need money and so forth. Finally, she declares bankruptcy. And there's this letter that lists all her possessions. She has so many forks, so many knives, so many plates, and at the bottom, and 5 slaves.
Yeah, and well, I find a lot of this in my family background, and, you know, they're right there with the horses, you know,
Yep.
mules and
As it turned out, she didn't own any livestock,
right,
but it was her household goods and 5 slaves. Now,
sure,
these slaves had been obviously rented out to somebody else. This one woman went to so-and-so as a washerwoman, and
So that was a source of income for her.
that was her only source of income with this drunk husband. And at one point, she writes to him and says, well, or I forget who says what, but their letters back and forth. And one of her slaves is Henry up there. And she says, well, I'm going to send you Henry. He has a wife and child here, but he'll get over that.
right.
That really distresses me.
The one, you know, the one thing that, and, you know, particularly doing a lot of family history, what you believe is the environment that you grow up in those early years. And clearly my great-grandfather grew up in an environment where slavery was just a part of the shipbuilding business. That's what his father did also. Well, I'm more interested in how did he evolve over the course of his life. And that's true of anybody today. I mean, if I had the same views that I did when I was in my 20s, what have I been doing for the last 50 years? I mean, that we all should be evolving. I get asked this question a lot, and I say, no, I don't apologize. And then I said, how about asking me what I would do if I met one of them? If I could go back, if there were a way I could meet somebody from the past. I said, first of all, I would probably thank them. Because from everything that I've read about the family background, they were very much an integral part of the community. They did not leave the property after the Civil War. They were still there. Actually, one of the houses that you'll go into, one of the descendants of the slave was still living there in 1960. So clearly, but then, you know, what alternatives were there to, you know, to slavery? You know, we think today, well, okay, if we free you, you just, you know, go buy property, get a job. No. You know, there were some very prominent black slave owners. I think I said this before. In the 1850 census, there were more free blacks than slaves. And that relationship between those two groups, I'd love to know more about, and I don't.
What are you talking, the whole US or?
Dorchester, I can only speak Dorchester County.
Dorchester?
I'm assuming Talbot may be the same, but maybe not so. Dorchester was a little bit unusual in that regard. I know we had a much higher percentage of free blacks in Dorchester than in the state of Maryland. And I don't know why. That would be sort of an interesting thing. I don't think there's anything sacred about Dorchester County. I would clearly say when I started teaching in 1971, Cambridge was more racist than Easton. I feel pretty
Yes.
comfortable making that statement.
I think that.
And there's still a lot of racism in Cambridge right now, which nobody wants to admit or talk about. You know, I remember when Obama was elected president, and boy, everybody in Dorchester County that was racist came out of the closet. And, you know, you'd be talking to a workman and you're white and they're white, and they said, well, that nigger Obama. And I look at it and say, excuse me, I voted for the man.
Yeah. I can give you some,
And you know, they're shocked because they just, go ahead.
I have some statistics. 1860, Dorchester County had 4,700 free blacks, 4,100 slaves. So
Right.
yes, there were more free blacks. Talbot had 3,000 free blacks, 3,700 slaves, more slaves. That, in both cases, it was fairly close. It's not.
There probably was more property wealth. There probably was more property wealth in Talbot. I mean, the Dorchester had some wealthy inhabitants, but for example, a perfect example would be my great grandfather, owned 250 acres, but basically was poor.
Well, in Talbot County had Lighthouse, and that accounts for hundreds of slaves.
That alone may make the difference. And it's funny because one of the largest slave owners in Cambridge, I should know his name, it slips me. If you look back at manumission records, he was always signing off on other people's manumitting a slave. So he already had probably more slaves than anybody, but clearly he was very happy to help people free their slaves. I mean, what it all boils down to is that and even more so today, we try to simplify history. History was complicated and messy, and it just doesn't fit into nice, neat little thing. This Columbus that was a slave. I mean, they're just all these wonderful stories about him. He lived on the property, and like I said, his descendants were still living on the property in 1960. Were there other opportunities? Even after the Civil War, there was very little opportunity. Okay, and then the sort of related question, should my great-grandfather have freed his slaves? That's an interesting question because you have to look at the alternatives. It would have looked nice. I mean, my father told me as a child that we never had slaves. Now, I don't know whether he knew and was just embarrassed to say it, or whether maybe he just didn't know. My grandfather's position was that his father had slaves but freed them before the Civil War. I didn't find any record of that. So
Maybe they didn't want to be freed.
yeah, I mean,
No, they wanted to be freed, but they sort of didn't know what to do.
Right.
They
Yeah.
wanted their
Yeah.
freedom.
Right.
And a lot of slave owners felt responsible for the well-being of these people.
right,
Because a lot of people cared about their slaves.
right.
Right.
And that's, especially the domestic slaves, less so with the field slaves.
Right.
But they, lost that train of thought.
Well, then
What are they gonna do?
Right.
So you free them and then what?
right. If I go back, and once, I think I mentioned this earlier, if I go back to
Some
the
places.
1860 record, of the 13 slaves my great-grandfather owned, only 3 were adults.
Mhm.
So,
Well, the other thing is, can you afford to keep the slaves? That was another.
Right.
Right.
right,
Well, that's why Edward Lloyd marched, I think it was 70 slaves down to Easton Point when the Union troops were recruiting.
Mhm.
He liked the money he got for them, and by 1860, or 61, whenever that march was, they were no longer economically feasible on his plantation.
right. But I wonder how economically feasible they were if 3 adults and 10 children. Obviously, the children did something, but they're not doing the work of an adult. I assume you're not putting a 6-year-old child out in the field to work.
Yes, they did.
Yes.
I would, yeah, but I,
Not the same.
yeah, no, I realize some of that happened, but then the major operation at Spocott was shipbuilding. And most of the slaves were involved in the shipbuilding.
Well, they could have been given me,
Right.
go fetch.
Yeah.
6-year-olds.
Clearly they were, but certainly having that many children and that many adults, I have to think there was a lot less economic benefit. And it was good that the families were kept together. You know,
Yes.
That's one of the real tragedies of slavery. That would, my great grandfather never sold a slave. And we did find a record in 1841 where he bought one who actually ended up at Spocott. But this was before he owned Spocott. My guess, at that point, he was working for his father in his father's shipyard. So we would have to assume that the slave was probably bought for that reason. It's an interesting question, and boy, I wish I knew more. I just love to go back to my great grandfather and just say, just what the heck were you thinking, you know? And you know, what were the alternatives?
Apparently there was a law, and I don't know if this was state, maybe it was even county, that you were not allowed to manumit a slave beyond the age of, I think it was 55. And why? Because 55 could no longer earn a living. That was old, really old, and would have no way to support himself or herself.
Well, I can't remember, but who wrote the Mockingbird?
Harper
Lee.
Yes, and she wrote another book.
Yeah,
And in the other book, who was the man, the lawyer?
yeah, the father.
Atticus.
Yeah.
In the other book, Atticus voted in a town meeting not to free a bunch of these slaves. And Scout
Mhm.
Right.
had a conniption fit, was so upset with him. And he had to explain to her, these people have no skills. They can't read, they can't write. What are we gonna do with them? We can't just let them loose. And
Sounds like our
never,
education
ever,
system today.
that makes such a difference in my whole perspective of slavery and, you know, freeing slaves. Really? You know, are you doing them any good or are you doing them some harm? Just
Yeah.
kind of
Well,
like-
and it's having deprived them of that, of the education and the
having done
skills.
that yet. So
Now, in places like White House, for instance, a lot of them did have skills. Yes, there were field slaves with no skills, but there were blacksmiths, there were carpenters.
Right.
They had a saleable skill.
And after the Civil War, that's what existed at Spocott. My grandfather would talk about, you know, this person had this skill, and they all, it was a you know, a beautifully integrated machine where they would all contribute. The one thing I do find interesting is that my great grandfather, after the Civil War, ended up by 1970, there was only one slave there. The others had been able to get off and were living nearby and whatnot. But the one, this Columbus Wheatley, and of course his wife Adeline, who never was a slave, she was always a free black. They had 7 children, and once again, there was no school available for them. And we will see the school. We'll actually go into school that my great grandfather built, and it was partially built by Columbus. But of course, there's no way his children would have been allowed to go there. It was an official Dorchester County school. But my great grandmother educated every one of those children, taught them how to read and write, and they were allowed to live on the property until they were able to go out and get a good job somewhere else. So, you know, I feel like, yes, the slavery may have been horrible, but at least, you know, it had sort of a happy ending.
Do you have a question?
Just want to ask,
Yeah.
just to make sure I heard this correctly. Did you say that by 1870, which was 5 years post-Civil War, only one slave?
There may have been, well, they weren't slaves. I mean, there may have been there were blacks living on the property, but I think the free blacks continued to live there. Columbus married Adeline, who was a free black. The others ended up on properties nearby, got
That was
jobs
my
on
question.
properties nearby.
Where did they go? The ones who left Spocott.
They became employees on other properties. Once
Like
again,
shared properties?
probably. I can only see in the census where they were. I don't know the history of that property, but, certainly they were largely unskilled, so they had to have been.
So is it a stretch or, to me, it's logical to conclude that they left for opportunity?
That would be, there was limited opportunity at Spocott because the family was poor. There's very, very little money, and my grandfather remembers, I think I mentioned, we uncovered a letter from my great-grandmother to her family saying my grandfather needed a coat. We had 250 acres, but my great-grandfather and grandmother couldn't afford a coat for their son, so that says a little bit. And the property really fell, and of course you'll see it really fell on hard times, and it ended up with my grandfather and his two brothers who were living in Baltimore at the time, and they wanted to sell the property because, basically my great-grandmother was an invalid the last few years of her life. The black woman Adeline really became her guardian, her nurse, her everything, and they became her friends. But my grandfather, once again, going back to historical preservation, he wasn't going to let it go. So he basically bought his two brothers out. Neither of his brothers, one was married, the other one was never married. None of them had children. He bought their share of Spocott and allowed them to live out the rest of their lives on the property. And they actually split the house. So my grandfather actually had to build a little house somewhere else on the property, but he let his two brothers live in Spocott. And then he became the sole owner, so he was never going to sell the property. So he poured every cent of money that he had. During the 20s, he poured all his money into property, and he bought back a couple pieces of property that were related that his father had owned. When the stock market crashed, he had nothing in the stock market, but he had land. So he kind of came out smelling like a rose.
What happened to all those 280 acres in this time after the slaves were freed and some of the free blacks went to work on neighboring properties? Were these fields just lying fallow?
There was farming continued, but I can see very few records. I have my great-grandfather's books in many cases, and I don't see where he's paying farmers. So I have a feeling when he got too old to farm, things just, kind of went, I'm sure the fields were kind of fallow. Obviously, if there was some farming, they would have made some money. So it's an interesting, from 1880 to 1900, he died in 1901. Would have been an interesting period to see kind of what was going on. And of course, my grandfather was there, but obviously, my only bit of evidence is my great-grandmother's letter saying he needs a coat, and that was in 94. So that tells me that there had been very little income, and a couple of the pictures that we have from that period, the house really is run down. It's really a dilapidated-looking structure. It looks so much better today because my grandfather made sure that by the time he died, the things had really pulled together. Another question, should George have maintained his friendship with two clearly racist people? If you know anything about Harry Byrd, he was about as much of a segregationist as a nationally prominent
Yeah, but
figure.
didn't he come around and didn't he support civil rights in the end?
His son
In a private.
became, there were two Harry Byrds.
Right.
I think it
His
was.
son, I think his son came
Was it
around.
like- yeah.
And you may be right.
In West Virginia.
It's in one of your
It's West
slides.
Virginia, not
West
Virginia.
One of your slides.
He did come around a little bit, but not, but then everybody sort of came around a little bit in the sixties.
Well,
Had to come around
perhaps-
a little bit.
Yeah.
Not everybody.
No,
No.
no,
They say,
there were
But-
those and there still are.
oh,
Yeah, and this James Thompson died, I think he died in the fifties. His son, however, was incredibly racist. His son was more prominent than he was.
But isn't the whole notion today that we should acknowledge and respect somebody having a different point of view without making them necessarily wrong?
That
And everybody-
should be the point of view.
Yeah,
Well,
that's
it's
not
okay.
happening.
I know it's not, but perhaps here's a situation where these three men had different points of view, but they shared something in common that kept them to be friends.
Well, or they enjoyed hearing the other point of view or wanted to hear it.
And I know that was important to my grandfather. And the fact that it always amazed me that when my grandfather never said anything negative to anybody. And I rarely talk politics with him. But when I did the whole fall of interviews and, you talked about people, he never said anything negative. He would say that, he disagreed with someone. I mean, that's fine. But he never talked about anybody personally. His notes, the closest, and I mentioned this before, the closest he came to it was he referred to his fellow Senator Millard Tidies as sometimes arrogant, which by all accounts he was.
You mentioned that your grandfather, while he was in the Senate, during the lunch,
Right,
he would go around to different tables
right.
and meet different people. And you said he was, the relationship, he wanted to build relationships, and relationships were more important to him
Yeah.
than their point of view,
Right,
although he was happy to get their point of view. So there you have it.
Right.
Right, but I guess the question is, was he a racist because he maintained those relationships?
I would say no.
Yeah.
A lot of people today would say yes. That's sort of the, and
The irony.
Well,
I know, it's complicated. And another aspect of my grandfather, he really wasn't a politician. He was a historian. And I can honestly see my grandfather sitting down and there's some key bill in the Senate and here's an opponent. And I can guarantee you my grandfather's getting into their family history and their background and to find out what they have in common. Oh,
Right.
yeah, it's time. And, that's, obviously with these two, that was the case. He was willing to overlook and did he have some
Wasn't
things?
the one guy his roommate in college?
Yeah, and of course, he went to roommate in college, so
Right.
it's complicated. Anyway, it's that time.
Thank you.
And we'll see you next week.
Yeah, and I like bringing this up because I just think not talking about, this is what drives me crazy is that so many people today don't want to talk about it. It's in the past. We need to talk. We need to talk about history,
Yes.
the good and the bad. I mean, it is what it is.
Why don't we just
I
recognize?
mean, we can be in the best country on the planet, but still have a shady background because.
This is true for slavery and it's true for the Holocaust. and it's
Yeah,
true-
should the German people apologize for Hitler?
Exactly. My husband's German and he doesn't
Right.
apologize.
Those statues.
Well, George, thank you very, very much.
Thank
We honor